If you want to learn how to make money on photography, it is important to understand the basics. Only a complete understanding of the basics will allow you to become a professional photographer. In this photography lesson, we will explore the last important parameter, and that is depth of field. I've covered other parameters in this lesson. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a professional photographer. My photos and articles are published in National Geographic and Discovery magazines. Let's not waste time. Let's go. Depth of field is the area of the photo that will be in focus. That is, it will be sharp. And here is an example showing shallow and deep depth of field. I focused on this object. The second object is no longer in focus. This happened because the depth of field is shallow. In this case, I achieved the shallow depth of field by using the aperture opening. That is, I opened it to the maximum. And now I'm changing the focus point by moving that depth of field to the second object. Both objects already look sharper. Here the depth of field is quite deep. So, what is the application of different depth of field? For example, deep depth of field is used for landscape and architectural photography to show all the details. That is, so that many details as possible in the frame are sharp. That is, in focus. A shallow depth of field allows you to highlight an important subject from the rest of the background and focus attention on it. Also, a shallow depth of field allows you to add depth and volume to your photos. This is sometimes very necessary when the subject is on a very colorful background. A shallow depth of field is often used for portrait photography to highlight the subject. There are three parameters that affect the depth of field. The first parameter is the aperture diameter. How does the aperture diameter affect the depth of field? The larger the aperture diameter, the shallower the depth of field, and the less light the sensor needs to get the photo correctly exposed, and vice versa. The narrower the aperture diameter, the deep the depth of field, and the more light the sensor needs. Another analog to the aperture is the eye. It doesn't matter who's, human or animal. Remember how the pupils of the eye narrow in bright sunlight. This limits the flow of light entering the eye. And in low light, they expand, increasing the amount of light that enters the eye. Knowing how to properly control depth of field is a very important part of the art of photography. We looked at the second factor that affects depth of field. It's the focal length of the lens. We've looked at focal length in this lesson. There is a very simple rule here. The longer the focal length, that is the longer the zoom, the shallower the depth of field. Conversely, the shorter the focal length, that is the smaller the zoom, the deeper the depth of field. Therefore, for portrait photography, more often use lenses with a focal length of 50 mm and more, that is, with zoom. For shooting landscapes, more often use lenses with a focal length shorter, for example, 14 mm. Finally, let's look at the third factor that affect depth of field. Let's look at an example like this. Let's put a photographer and a subject. This is the first subject. This is the second subject. The closer the subject is to the photographer, the shallower the depth of field. Conversely, the farther the subject is from the photographer, the deeper the depth of field. This is how the distance from the subject to the photographer affects the depth of field. It is necessary to memorize it and work with it on automatic. This can be used in following cases. For example, you are shooting a portrait. The depth of field is too shallow for you. To do this, you can either close the aperture or move farther away. For example, if you can't close the aperture because of low light, you can simply move farther away. Conversely, if the depth of field is too deep for you and you want to reduce it, and your lens can't open the aperture wider, then just move closer to your subject. Now, knowing what factors affect the depth of field, plus a little practice, and you will easily learn how to control it. And this is very important for photographers. So, let's summarize. Depth of field is affected by three parameters. The first is the size of the aperture opening. The narrower the aperture, the deeper the depth of field in the image. The wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field in the image. The second parameter that affects of depth of field is the focal length of the lens. The longer the focal length, the shallower the depth of field. Conversely, the shorter the focal length, the deeper the depth of field. The third parameter is the distance from the photographer to the subject. The closer the subject to the photographer, the shallower the depth of field. The farther the subject is from the photographer, the deeper the depth of field. That's how simple it is. That's all for now.